Today we're going to be covering off a few things. So how many of you were in the session just prior to this one with the Bulgarian engineering team? Okay, a couple of you. So what I'm going to do is just try and do a quick recap. There were quite a few questions off the back of that, so I feel like it might be worth, especially since we've got a whole new crew, just running through maybe some of that info in the console. And then what I'm going to get into is what we're doing to basically take on a new modern approach around extensibility when it comes to our cloud automation services. So this is me. I love it when you go to IT conferences and basically there's a bunch of guys who sit behind their desk, they're slightly overweight, and they put up these images of them, getting into the outback wilderness to try and make out as if, this thing doesn't exist. So this is my take, this is me hiking across New Zealand. If you're a Twitter person, if you're on social media, you can find me at Grand Orchard. I'm a staff systems engineer with VMware, working within our cloud management business unit. So I've been working with this stuff quite a lot, especially during the whole beta and development phases, working with a lot of customers around the design partner program and what we've been doing in this space. So when I talk about the cloud automation services, it really is made up of three unique products. So those are Cloud Assembly, Service Broker, and CodeStream. And if I pick out what the workhorse is here, it's really Cloud Assembly. So this is the place where you do your blueprinting. It's where we expose the capability to do infrastructure as code within the platform, abstract away the cloud from underneath, the different clouds from underneath, present you with a common API surface that you can then interact with. Now, depending on what your bent is, you might just want to have a service catalog that consumes that stuff via API. So that's what Service Broker is for us. Alternatively, you might have pockets within your organization who are looking to adopt this as part of a more modern development process. They want to look at continuous delivery, and CodeStream fits very nicely into that mold. So it allows you to tie together a bunch of different developer tools as well as custom integrations if you want to go ahead and build those. Finally, you'll notice we've got some of the pivotal stuff in there as well. That's, to be honest, there's a few bits in there that actually plug into CodeStream right now. That's more of a future-looking statement around what we're doing with functions and so on within the platform. So this is a quick snapshot of Cloud Assembly. So what I've got on screen, and I basically had this in here originally because I didn't think I'd probably spend too much time on it, but I think I am going to go into the console and just give you guys a quick overview since most of you weren't in here the session before. But what I absolutely love about this is the fact that we're not just exposing IaaS constructs. So if you think back to Joe's talk this morning, the 5 different levels or the 10 different levels, right, of 10 different approaches of what you need to plug and play in order to build applications. We're exposing basic IaaS constructs on-prem, off-prem. We're bringing through Lambda. We've got some stuff going on to bring in serverless off the back of Azure functions, as well as on-premises. So we're starting to tackle some of those. And then what you can see on screen there is not just a typical EC2 instance, but then also off the back of that, RDS. So some of the native services that are there also. So looking at PaaS, IaaS, and functions, all within the one platform. So before I jump into extensibility too much, one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, is vRealize Orchestrator still going to be a thing? And absolutely. What we want to do is make sure that, again, to Joe's point this morning, you've got choice. So if you've got a bunch of investment, a bunch of skills around vRealize Orchestrator, you want to reuse those for your extensibility use cases, you absolutely can do so. What we have heard loud and clear is that when people are looking to interact with services in the public cloud, when they're starting to look at reliance on more components as part of an application stack as opposed to an infrastructure stack, they wanted something that was a bit more lightweight and a bit more modern. So we basically went down the path of then introducing a second option, which is action-based extensibility. The big upside of this is that you're not tied into specifically using JavaScript and all the constructs of vRealize Orchestrator. If you want to write in Python, which I much prefer to do, you can do so. You've got the Node.js support as well in there. You'll see PowerShell coming through also as a viable language option. So you've really got a lot of flexibility and you can kind of meet extensibility where your skill set and where your preferred language is actually at. So when we look at action-based extensibility, it's really not too different in terms of what you would expect versus vRealize Orchestrator. So there are the 4 elements there, right? Subscriptions, so you're going to listen the same way as you would typically today. What events are going on? What do I want to listen to? Do I want to put filters on those to say, hey, if a particular user requests something, then perform an action. If it comes out of a project, do something different. So we can do things like filtering, as well as looking at the different states that things actually go through when they're provisioning. There's the concept of the payload, which is all the metadata that gets associated with a deployment. So you can then use that. You can potentially pass that out. You can take that and push it as inputs to different actions and so on. The action itself is just a simple block of code, or it could be a fairly complex block of code, but basically an action. And then action flows is the idea of being able to chain multiple actions together. So again, you're trying to break things down, and when you look at the approach that you're really taking with something like serverless, while you can build out larger functions, you probably want to be breaking them down into more discrete, reusable patterns that you can then bring together in a way that actually makes sense for you. So that's the end of my presentation. I wanted to spend a lot more time actually in the UI and actually taking you through this in real life. It's good to set some context there, but I think I always get more out of seeing people risk their credibility on screen by trying to do this live. If I was at home, I would have sacrificed some chickens to the demigods. Being here in England, I'm not sure what your livestock rules are, so I thought I'd just wing it and hope for the best. So within Cloud Assembly, I'm in as an administrator, so you see a bunch of different stuff in here. I'm going to risk this and see if we've actually got the marketplace set up. You need a My VMware account, but basically the marketplace is the idea of being able to come in and actually find different application stacks that have been either created by VMware or contributed by somebody else and validated by VMware. So you can see there's a few different options that you've got in here, things like Hadoop, Magento, a main stack, Jenkins, so on and so forth. And the idea behind this, and let's risk this again. All right, we'll do a get. We'll go next. I'll try and drop it into my project and see what happens. Okay, hasn't failed. We're refreshing, and there it is. Okay, so we can come in and we can basically see that all the pre-configuration, a bunch of parameters, all the Cloud Init. How many of you are familiar with Cloud Init? Have you used AWS or OpenStack before? Okay, so Cloud Init is basically a much more open standard for being able to execute or take agnostic, deterministic kind of statements about the configuration you want in guest, not to be confused with like a real config management tool, but basically being able to do things like say, here are the packages that I want to install, here's some scripts that I want to execute at boot, post-boot, just during run command and so on and so forth. So you can see here, like there's a fair amount of detail, and let me just zoom that because I'm sure that it's kind of hard to see. But as you'll note, there's like a bunch of work that goes into that. So it's all transparent. It's all there in the YAML, so it's not like you're pulling down a black box OVA and just being expected to trust the fact that VMware hasn't done anything there. All of this is highly transparent, so you can go through, see what commands we're running, what the scripts are actually doing, and really, again, look at either accelerating your time to delivery in terms of getting some of this content live and in your catalog, or alternatively just using it as a way to learn what some of the best practices are around things like how do you do multi-line comments, not multi-line comments, multi-line commands within Cloud Config. How do you go about configuring inputs and actually enumerating different values so that when I go to deploy, as an example, and you see the different inputs that are available, how you can actually go about sort of tuning that and having nice friendly names, etc. So you can look at it also just as a way to actually learn and really get started with the platform. So kind of cool. When it actually comes to working with the blueprints, and we'll do this, I can't talk and drive at the same time. So let's go with that. All right, so I always love this. I still get a kick out of this every time I see it. I've worked with a bunch of infrastructure as code tools. I get to spend a fair amount of time in IDEs these days and sort of mucking around with different stuff. And one thing that always kills me is trying to remember the stupid schemas, what the syntax is, what the mandatory fields are, and so on and so forth. And what I really love about what VMware has done with this approach to infrastructure as code is that we're actually automatically generating YAML for you as you go through the process of just dragging and dropping that stuff onto the canvas. So it makes it really, really easy, again, to get started. You don't have to know any of the schema, effectively. In a similar fashion, when I come across here and go to image, it's automatically looking up to see what image mappings you've actually created. So image mappings basically being, if you look across vSphere, you're going to have templates. When you go to AWS, you're going to have AMIs. In Azure, you're going to have VHDs. So when I say Ubuntu, I'm effectively just creating what is a map or a hash table that maps then to the appropriate values for those in each of those clouds. But again, you don't have to think too hard about it when you're actually consuming it because we're actually giving you like type-ahead IntelliSense capability there. So really, really nice. Some other little additions that make it really easy to work and navigate your way around. You'll see this little blue button, and it's got a tooltip now, so it kind of steals my thunder. But if I click on Insert Optional Parameters, then it literally spits everything out that you may want to configure in addition to the basics that are required there. So again, really, really useful for starting to spin things up. And apart from the hints that you get in terms of things like single quotes, square brackets to figure out whether you're talking about strings or arrays, etc., you can actually click on each of those keys and see there, so this is a string, so what you're expecting. Tags are coming back as an array and expects to get key value. When we look at something like tags, again, if I just hit enter, and I've got fat fingers, so I'll do that again. If I hit enter, you'll see on screen that it's again prompting you for what it is that you want to actually put in. So I can just do foo. It expects then that only value is available, so I'll do bar. Again, just really trying to make that whole process a hell of a lot easier for you to get started as far as that infrastructure as code approach is actually going. All right, so what I'll do is nuke all of my optional components here. We'll call it Bob. We'll call it Network 1 or Network 2, that will do the job. All right, so at this stage, I haven't quite actually got everything that I need because I need to connect my machine to the network. There we go. So again, automatic interpolation when you're creating relationships and dependencies between the different objects. And similarly, if I was to, let's do something here, just go Control X, get rid of that. Oh, that's not going to be happy anymore, but you can see there, so that's basically changed what's on canvas. If I come in again, so I can do the exact opposite, which is start with a bunch of infrastructure as code, come in, paste my YAML, and actually have it built out. And for me, as I said, although I spend a lot of time in IDEs, I'm a very visual guy. So I like to be able to see something on screen to be able to understand what the architecture actually is. Something simple like this, it's pretty sensible, but when you actually start building out and having multiple components, multiple networks and so on, being able to visualize that code is really, really handy. Right, so I'm going to drop one last thing in here, which is an idea of a constraint, which is just basically a way of being able to say, based on some freeform tags that I've dropped within the system, I want you to preferentially place this stuff somewhere. And I'll admit that it's been a little while since I've done this from memory, so that may fail, but we'll see how we go. So that in this case, I've put in platform AWS. It's fairly explicit, right? Like I'm literally saying drop this on AWS. You could do something a lot more clever. You could have things like values for availability, performance, security, compliance, whatever it might be. And that way, people don't need to know the actual platform. They just need to understand what governance levels are required or something similar. And then you hit go, and it would place it in the appropriate spot. I'm going to hit deploy, and we'll see what happens. All right, so we've got VMUG, UK. Can't remember what number I was up to, so we'll just try 10. All right, so that's underway. One of the really cool things that I like about the way we approach this, now we'll see if that's not quite there yet. Nope, still not. Refresh, let's do that. There we go, boom. All right, so one of the cool things, and I've got this zoomed right in, so the whole user experience at the moment isn't looking so awesome, but typically this would actually show up really, really nicely. There we go, this is what I'm after. All right, so allocation finish for the network. Great. Zoom back up, scroll back up. Cloud network, cloud machine. Where was that? Oh, there we go, allocation. All right, so this is concept of the provisioning diagram. Now, I mentioned when we had that first slide and you've got multiple clouds, when you talk about clouds, it's not just, hey, I want to provision to AWS. When you talk about vSphere, it's not just, hey, I want to provision to this vCenter, right? You're going to have multiple clusters or you're going to have different regions. So how on earth do we actually figure out where stuff should actually be placed? And how would you, potentially as somebody who's trying to make this occur in the way you want it to, allow that to happen? So what we can see here is when we've gone through the allocation phase, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and hope you guys can still see, just so that's actually pretty big, isn't it? That's cool. So you can see here what's happened is that within this particular project called Barramundi, I've got a few different zones available that this actually could land on. I can see one that's green and a few that are red. Hopefully you're not colorblind, that's something we probably need to fix. However, you kind of get the idea of what's happened, right? Which is, if I take a look at AP Southeast 1 and I scroll down, it's like, well, flavors, which is just our, we've taken that language about sizing and we're just calling it flavors. Yeah, we've got a small mapping for that. We also happen to have a Ubuntu image, so far we're doing all right. However, when we get here, it's just, for whatever reason, saying the hosts in this don't actually match the requirements, while here it actually does. If we come across a little bit further and take a look at, let's pick something else, East Melbourne Data Centre, so that's vCenter. We can see that there's not actually an image mapping for Ubuntu. If we take a look at another instance, which is in our Sydney lab, we can see here that the hard constraints that I've mentioned about choosing platform AWS can't be matched. We can see the tags that are actually available there, such as location Sydney, that it's our dev environment. So you really get a lot of visibility into what's going on. And all of this just helps you to build out a bit of a taxonomy around, okay, here's where I want things to land and here's how I'm going to sort of build that out. Again, quite a powerful capability. I quite like that. So when, again, just to come back onto this idea of, we're actually not just trying to expose IaaS objects. So here we can see, the cluster instance for RDS. You can do things like creating on the fly IAM roles. You can drop Lambda functions in there as well. Something that would be very easy to demonstrate and quite popular would be a Route 53 side of things. So you could imagine, looking at those constructs, you could effectively have an S3 bucket, which you push a static website into, right? You could have the Lambda functions there, which are associated with what you're actually doing. And then on the back end, you could actually have RDS providing you with database services. And you could have an app that's completely free of any IaaS constructs, but is still actually being provisioned out of something that VMware is giving you. So really, really powerful. And I think this is a good example of VMware actually looking to meet the 95th percentile of what people are doing in terms of application form factors. Quite cool. So before I jump into extensibility, because I've got about 20 minutes left and I would like to spend a little bit of time on it, any questions on the general content so far? Anything you want to ask? No? Michael looks like he's gone to sleep. No? Just leaning back. All good. All right, so we're going to tap in now and take a look at the idea of actions. What I will do is copy this because I want to come back and do something with it shortly. And then I'll nuke it. All right. So when we take a look at what it actually is required here, so I'm going to pull up a few different examples. I apologize if you are more familiar with this. I'm going to sort of step through with the expectation that maybe some of you don't have the experience with Python that others of you might. So this is an action. And as you can see, we've got the option of the runtime there, which we define. And in fact, what I'll do instead, let me go back and I'll create a new action so that I can show you actually what occurs. So we've got a bunch of out-of-the-box templates for you as well. Again, Kickstarters to help you actually start writing some basic functions. They're not going to be industrialized code, but if you wanted to do things like going out to info blocks or assigning a static IP to a VM, for example, there's a simple example of doing that. If you wanted to potentially assign tags, you could do that. If you wanted to poll a REST endpoint to see, what would be an example of that? Maybe you're waiting to see if a change has been approved in ServiceNow or something, who knows. Basically, there's a bunch of these different templates that you can just tap into and make use of. So you'll select that, and then you'll select the runtime, and as you can see, it will literally flip the code on the fly for you between those two different things. So that's just flipping between templates. You can't write code in Python and have us cleverly convert it to JS for you. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples. Now, in this one here that I'm going to show you, again, just some simple Python code. With the way Lambda works, we can't just import the request module normally. So I've got a few different things that we're actually pulling in. And in this case, what we're looking to do is basically go out and find a particular Slack webhook. And all I'm doing here is really externalizing values. It's nice and handy to have that idea of inputs on the side. It makes it very easy for you to test. You can put static values in there. However, when you want something that's a bit more dynamic, potentially I want to send a Slack webhook to my channel when I'm doing stuff with this, but you want to send it to your own. So instead of actually having that in there, we can parameterize that and say we're going to pass that value through at request time. So in this case, what I've done is make use of Aws Systems Manager. Just again, it's nice and easy to get to because it's public facing. Using Boto 3, it's very easy to interact with and get data out of. And I've created a few different things in here. So here's our VMUG UK Slack webhook. Here's the value. So I'll just do a really quick and dirty test of this. There's been some intermittent connectivity issues, so we're going to hold on here and hope for the best. So you can see our input parameter. It looks like it's running. There we go. All right, so we're happy. And I didn't print it. So you can see the outputs though here, right? So you've got the key, which is VMUG UK Slack webhook, and then the value, which is actually the value of the webhook. So at the moment, that's just doing a retrieval. So a better example of that would probably be if you had a password you wanted to externalize, right? You're not going to drop a password in clear text into an action. You're going to put that into an external service, something like Vault, something like SSM, secret server, whatever it might be. So you go out and you can actually query that in order to get it and pass it through for the next action. So probably would have been good if I had a slide building out as I was doing this. So think about this. We've just gone off and we've queried for a webhook. That's our first thing that we've done. All right, so next up, we've got this idea of a Slack notification here. So again, just doing some simple imports. What I didn't mention is the idea of where inputs are coming from. So we can see the inputs are here, but really the inputs are actually largely going to be the payload of the metadata of the machines or the objects that you're requesting. So when you request it, it'll just do a dump of all the data, and then it will combine it with any additional inputs that you've got here. So we can see here, I've basically built out this action with the expectation that I'm going to be passing that VMUG UK Slack webhook, that's a mouthful, I'm going to be passing that back through and actually making use of that. So then I can actually do a very simple REST request. I'm going to do a post to the URL, and I don't know where I've defined that URL. Oh, here we go. It's the webhook, duh. Sorry, my bad. And then I've actually got the idea of being able to pass a message through. So again, that's coming from the output of a previous action. We're going to feed that in. Those things are going to combine, and then we're actually going to send a message through. So what I'll do is open up the idea of the actual action workflow where we're starting to combine these things together, and then I'll come back out and we'll take a look at a few other examples, and I'll try and explain it a little bit better for you. All right, so again, you'll notice that VMware now has a love affair with YAML. So not only are our blueprints in YAML, but the action flows that you see here are also just standard YAML, right? Another industry standard. We're not trying to do anything proprietary here. When you look at CodeStream and the pipelines, they're all actually YAML on the back end, so you can either create a new pipeline as code or export existing pipelines back out as code also. Now, what I've put together here is really a number of different types of actions. So the first one up you'll see here is this idea of getting the parameter that we're after from Systems Manager. I'm also basically just trying to do some simple maths task because it's a little bit easier than having to provision machines and try and explain the schema of that stuff to you. And then based on the webhook and the starting number, we're going to send a Slack notification. And then we're going to do a little bit of simple maths, and we're going to send another Slack notification. Now, what you'll note when you look at the visual over here on the right-hand side of screen is that things don't have to necessarily be performed synchronously. So immediately off the bat, when you think about those tasks like getting the parameter that I'm looking for, as well as checking what my starting number for this maths equation are, those two don't have any kind of dependency whatsoever. So the very first action that I'm taking here is a fork. So basically fork it out. We can see that it's just an array, so I could actually put multiple actions in there. I could put as many streams effectively to run asynchronously as I wanted to in order to basically, what's the word I'm after, optimize the flow of what I've actually got going on there. Now, once those two actually run, we come back down here to this join. So why is the join important? So the join is important because what it's actually doing is taking the outputs of those two asynchronous functions and it's merging them together to be the payload for the next lot of input. Otherwise, what would happen is effectively one would overwrite the other in terms of the output that it's passing as an input to the next function. And then we move into, again, the more simple serialized or synchronous functions that we perform there. So I'm going to test this and see what happens. It might take a little while. So let's see, we've got our VMUG UK channel up. You can see that's running. Okay, so our starting number is 22. What would have been better is if I actually told you what the, if I actually printed out what the maths was going to be that was getting performed here. But in effect, you can see we've gone off and we've got the webhook to be able to send that payload to this channel. We've got our starting number. We've sent the Slack notification, and it's failed. And this is going to be because of that silly timeout issue. I'm just going to run it again. Yep. All right. We'll run this one more time. And let that go through. All right, hey, there we go. So we've got our starting number, we've got our new number, and we can see that's actually completed. And this will actually pull back the logs of each of the individual functions. It might take a little while to do so. But then you've got that ability to see, obviously, what's gone on. And depending on how verbose you make your logging or your print statements, if that's the way you log, you'll actually get a bunch of data out there around what's actually occurring. Now, when it comes to creating these, you're probably looking at it and going, my God, these UUIDs are terrible. How on earth am I meant to actually figure out what to do with the next actions? In fact, what you can do is create action 98, and when I come in and do action ID, you'll see once again, we're actually trying to be clever and help you. So you get the friendly name that you've actually started with, and it will automatically append a comment so that when you're actually coming in here to look at something like an action flow, you're not just working with those unique IDs, you are getting a handle on what the actions are that you're trying to run in there. All right, so that's our really quick overview on actions. And of course, I've just, oh, there we go, awesome. No. All right, okay, that's brilliant. We'll clear that. So what I just wanted to show you next, really, it's not the actions, it's an action run. That's why. There we go. All right, so clearly that's a fairly contrived example. Again, just wanting to show you the concept of the actions and how things can actually tie together and some of the options you've got in terms of running those asynchronously, how you can split them. One thing I didn't show you is actually that there's also the switch capability, so you can do conditional swaps in terms of what your next action wants to be based on the return that you get from a previous action. How many of you have done any kind of extensibility with VRO and vRealize automation? So about half the room. So do you remember what it was like before there was the ability to just extract the properties out via a workflow that VMware gave you, having to actually build that and write it yourself? So what I want you to do is compare that to what's on screen at the moment. So all we need to do is basically, in fact, you could just come in here and look at what's on screen, but if you wanted to prettify it, then you can just do a simple JSON dumps of your inputs. You can put the indent. I'm not sure if the log will still be there. There we go. And basically, you can see all the different data points that actually come through off the back of that. Now, what's going to be dropping this week is the ability to actually interact natively with the Cloud Automation Services API out of this. And you may think, why is that so exciting and interesting? It really just allows you to do things like following some of the links that you've got in here. So when you start getting into like the deployments and you want to look for all of the children objects, for example, just being able to say, hey, I want to query all the children objects of this deployment and aggregate the data in some kind of way and manipulate it, that makes a lot of sense and makes things a lot easier. But really, it's just a nice, simple way to start interacting with the platform from an extensibility point of view. Again, as I said, you've still got the ability to continue working with vRealize Orchestrator. That's going to stay, as far as I'm aware, for a very long time. But you've just now got this additional method to be able to work on and interact. So I've got 8 minutes, which probably gives me time for about 3 or 4 questions. So I'll pause now and see if there's anyone who wants to query anything? No? Yeah. So the question was, does the join wait for both of those forks to finish? Yeah, that's right. So basically, because you've got like the next step, it's waiting for those to come in. And until those conditions are met where those two values have actually both come in and the join has been performed, it won't jump down to the next step. So this is actually something that I was playing with earlier and had to ping somebody about, because what you could do, and this is where you start to run into problems, is if you had, okay, so what is it, actions 1 and 2, I do the join, action 1. So if I actually just change this to be action 4, and then action 2, where are you? Do the same thing here and say action 4. You might think that that is going to do the same thing, but in effect, you're going to have one is going to overwrite the other. So you can get around it by naming the outputs differently, but then you're starting to like introduce some really weird coding practices based on whether things are going to join. So you're far better off using the merge there and just allowing the native capability of the product to take care of that sensibly for you. All right, so let me show you then briefly, since we do have a little bit of time left. Just throw your hand up if you do have any more questions, but I didn't see. Yep. Okay, bringing in existing VRO workflows quickly. So once you register VRO as an endpoint, oh, and that's the same timeout that's causing other issues. Let's just try that again. So the workflows themselves are going to come in. The thing that's going to be very different is going to be the machine model that you're actually interacting with. You know, so here we go. So you can see all the workflows that are in here at the moment, which are just reading directly off the back of vRealize Orchestrator. Now, all the integration work that you do outbound is just going to be transferable because it's still the same, right? What will differ is the payload that you actually get to start with. So that you'll probably want to put like a little wrapper to begin to change the payload. And then the other thing that will change is the object model that you're using to write back to the Cloud Automation Services object as opposed to a vRealize Automation object or the machine, effectively. What I will do now is I'll quickly bring up, like, again, the Python actions are really easy to see and visualize. So allow me to do, here we go, rename VM. Now you'll see here, the beauty of this is that you don't have to do any clever writebacks. It just automatically assumes that anything that you have as an output off the final action of your action flow actually gets written back to the machine. So what's happening here, you can see that we've got, it's pulling through the inputs, resource names, it's pulling through the configured new name. This resource names actually comes from the payload, although that's in there as an option for you. Then you can see we're creating a new object that's called outputs. We set its value to be outputs resource names equals inputs resource names. The resource name 0, because it is actually an array, becomes now new name. And then when you return it, that's actually updated automatically on the machine. So you don't have to do any complex interactions with, like, the, God, what did you have to do? You had to muck around with, like, the IaaS entity and the cafe entity in order to, get things right. This, again, becomes a much easier model. So it'll be the same thing with vRealize Orchestrator. I just don't have a simple workflow here to show you what that looks like, but it's the same idea. The output that you get from the workflow, you can basically write it back to the properties, or you can use it to write back directly to update machine or any other attribute on that. So yeah, it'll be a bit different, but all the outbound work that you've done to integrate with the third-party systems remains the same. Input payload changes, and the way that you write it back changes. Yeah. Cool, all right. Any other questions? No? All right. Source control. Okay, so that is being worked on. What I will show you is some work that they've done around, is it here? No, it must be the individual actions. Let's pick that one. Oh, I'm having a mental blank, damn it. So there is actually a versions tab in here somewhere that I can't remember how to get to. That's terrible. But so there's native versioning in the product. So there are two things that we've kind of worked on. We don't want to go to a customer and say, you have to have an existing version control system in order to get version control out of the product. So for blueprints, for your functions or actions, yes, we have built-in version control. What's being worked on at the moment is the ability to extend that out and say, actually, I want to use my own native version control and bring that through. Now, what you could do, again, remembering what these are, and these are just functions, it's very easy for you to do something like a get and pull through some code that you've got stored in an external repo, pull that in and actually have that be your function and it be executed. So there's some clever and different ways to think about it, a little bit like what you do with boilerplate scripts for software components and stuff. I think we'll see, again, some different methodologies and ideas starting to come through in terms of how you do extensibility and, where's the right place to store different things, external key values, external source control, and how you actually bring that together. But yeah, at the moment, no native support for external version control systems. Can anyone remind me what I said I was actually going to come back and show you? Because I've completely forgotten in responding to questions. No? No? All right. What I'll do really quickly is come in and just show you what the subscriptions actually look like. So again, this is just a test sub. The event topic that we actually want to trigger off. So these are all being, again, built out and growing. So we can do things around, so onboarding. This is quite cool. So we can do onboarding again for public cloud workloads as well, not just vSphere anymore. So you could effectively go out and say, right, here are all the machines that have been discovered. I want to select these 4. I want to assemble them in this way as a blueprint, and I want that to actually pull in. And then off the back of that, again, we can actually trigger different workflows or actions to occur. Network configuration, all the typical compute, provision, post-provision, etc. When it comes down to doing filters, again, just trying to make this easy. Here are just some simple examples of what you could actually put in. I'm going to embarrass myself by not being able to remember the key here, but if I do, is it Alt, Option, no? What do you reckon, would an emoji work? I think it probably wouldn't. No, damn it. There it is, okay. So again, if you can actually remember what the hotkey is, you can actually get it to spit out then all the potential options of the schema as you start to work through that, so that again, you don't really muck up and make any mistakes about what you're trying to put in there as filters. So you can do filters here. You can do those on custom properties potentially that are in the blueprints, which could be assigned at a blueprint level. They could be assigned at a project level or something similar. You could trigger on username. You could trigger on the project ID or the blueprint ID. But you've also got options as well when you start to get into the functions to actually look at what the payload is again, right? So you could actually be looking at some of these properties here, but you could also be evaluating as part of the functions themselves and going, right, what's in this payload? If this exists, then do certain tasks. So very powerful capabilities around the subscriptions. And what I'll just do is cheat and stick in event username. This is really, really important, by the way. Just as a terrible example, we were doing a big demo of this for a customer, and everything started failing because I was mucking around with the extensibility actions and built some subscriptions, and it was affecting everybody in the org. So especially when you're doing development, definitely the idea of filtering and making sure that these only trigger for you is really, really important. Blockable tasks, again, important when you're trying to do write-backs, because if your machine progresses past that, then that data's all gone. So being able to say, stop, I want you to wait until these things are complete and you've written back. Basically, we can do all of that. So we can see here any input parameters that you actually have for those actions. Let's pick a different one, Slack notification. Again, that's showing us no parameters, what the outputs are. And then again, being able to do a block, right? And what happens if you have a blocking task and effectively when you're waiting for it to finish, it times out? What do? Do you kick off some kind of recovery workflow? So that's the option you've got here to be able to do then again. So just some good error handling in terms of what we're doing with extensibility, and make sure you've got some level of recoverability around what's going on. All right, so with that, I'm going to wrap up your first look at ABX, or action-based extensibility. I hope that was somewhat useful, and if you do have any other questions, I'll be hanging around for a little while. Cool, thanks everyone.